Good evening. My name is Christoph Straub and I'm the Senior Manager of Adult Learning here at TIFF. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's special event, David Koepp on Jurassic Park. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge where tonight's event is taking place. We're on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community and to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities by showing the works of Indigenous filmmakers here at TIFF. For instance, on November 12th, we're screening the world premiere of Thursa Jean Cuthand's short film Woman Dress as part of the program 5 at 50, an intimate look at contemporary LGBTQ2+ lives and identities. Presented in partnership with the National Film Board of Canada, the screening will be followed by a discussion with Thursa, as well as filmmakers Michelle Pearson-Clark, Tiffany Shung, Vivek Shraya, and Michael V. Smith, who are also presenting world premieres of their short film reflections on LGBTQ2+ lives and identities today. Tickets for this event are still available at our box office and online. Now, on behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oréal Paris, and Visa, and our major public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. Thank you also to our members and our donors for their generous contributions to TIFF and to those who support TIFF's learning programs year-round. A big thank you to TIFF's own film reference library for providing us with tonight's 35mm print of Jurassic Park, and to our programming partner, Harper Collins Canada. A reminder that all season you can enjoy special screenings and theatrical runs of buzzworthy titles, including Martin Scorsese's epic saga The Irishman, starring Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci. Tickets are available at our box office and online at tiff.net. And for tonight's event, we are pleased to be joined by host and moderator Radheyan Simonpillai, a culture writer, he gets his own applause, a culture writer for Toronto's Now magazine and a film critic for CTV's national breakfast show, Your Morning. He also contributes to CTV News and CBC Radio. Please join me in welcoming Rad.
Thank you. Welcome to Jurassic Park. I'm not going to say that like David Attenborough, so or Richard Attenborough, and for obvious reasons. I wanted to start off tonight by talking about my first encounter with Jurassic Park. The movie opened in '93. I was 11 years old when it came out. And think about when I was a child. My childhood, I was only actually allowed to go to the movies once a year. I grew up with a family where we couldn't really afford, like the movie theaters was a luxury. So we could only afford to do that once a year. So, my parents would send me off with my uncle. And so in '93, when Jurassic Park was in theaters, my uncle came to me and he was like, okay, what are we going to watch? I chose Super Mario Brothers. Big mistake. I mean, watching Super Mario Brothers, I realized it was a big mistake, but I didn't really realize until a year later how big a mistake it was, because it was a year later when I finally watched Jurassic Park. I don't know if you guys remember this, but Jurassic Park was actually in theaters for over a year. Like it was, it opened June 1993, played right until it was released on home video in October 1994. It was still on 100 screens when it was released on home video, and that's how I watched it on VHS. With a pan and scan on a 27-inch tube TV, and it was still glorious, okay? I mean, here's the thing, of course you want to see a movie like Jurassic Park the way you're going to see it, 35mm, big screen, because you got these big dinosaurs, the big special effects and all the thrills, but it's a movie that still works on a 27-inch screen, like life still breaks free on a 27-inch screen because, I often refer to this movie as the last great blockbuster, right? I mean, you got Steven Spielberg firing on all cylinders. You got Laura Dern and Jeff Goldblum firing on all cylinders. And you have the great words from David Koepp, our special guest this evening, the screenwriter. So let me talk a little bit about David Koepp. He's a screenwriter, a director, and a novelist recently. His screenwriting work includes, he worked for Steven Spielberg, David Fincher, Sam Raimi, Brian De Palma, Some of his movies like Jurassic Park and SpiderMan have not only that they've reshaped our industry entirely, and together they accumulated a $6 billion box office gross. As a director, he's made movies like Stir of Echoes and Premium Rush, which is exactly as awesome as it sounds. And now as a novelist, he has Cold Storage, which is published by HarperCollins, available today. It's a biochemical thriller about a fungus that just cannot be contained. With that in mind, let me bring out our guest today, David Koepp. Please welcome to the stage.
Jeff and Laura were sleeping together.
I don't remember. I think that was actually after. Yeah, that was after. I was actually definitely after. Thank you. I'll tell you my first experience watching Jurassic Park. It was great fun to make. I was young when I was 29 when I wrote it and 30 when it came out. While all during developing it, writing the script, shooting prep dailies, there was no way of knowing if the dinosaurs were going to look fake or not, which was really the only question on anyone's mind. And the first time I saw the movie, CG was in its infancy. Terminator 2 had come out the year before, but it wasn't it was fantastical, melty things. It wasn't something that was supposed to be an animal. So we'd never seen anything like that before. And I the first time I saw it, I was alone in the Amblin screening room because Steven is famously secretive, and when a movie's all done, he'll screen it for the people who worked on it one at a time, so they don't talk among themselves. And he's a little paranoid, but it's worked for him. So I was alone in the screening room, and the movie started, and it's all going well, and the story seems to be working. And then the big brachiosaur walks out of the lake, and I started looking around the room, like, "Are you guys seeing this?" And of course, there was no one there. And so I watched the whole movie, and you really only have your own self to trust or judge. And I came out and I said, "I think it's great." I wasn't entirely sure. And then I saw it with an audience, and it was just a fantastic, moving experience to see people that wrapped up in a movie and that blown away by it. And never in a million years did I think that 26 years later I'd be standing here talking about it still, and that it would be something that held up. And I'm just enormously grateful for the small part that I played in getting it on screen, and I hope you like it. And if you like, please stick around. We're gonna do a Q&A afterwards. And have you guys seen it before? Because have you seen it on video? They have seen it on video. Okay, so and do you find it scary? I'm just curious. I want to ask. You do not. Not even the raptors in the kitchen. The raptors in the kitchen toward the end, maybe on a big screen. Really scary. It's going to be really loud. All right, I'm going to check back with you after the screening. I hope you like it. Thank you. Scarier, right, though? Big. It was noisier. It was louder. Still not scary. All right. There's just no pleasing some people.
This is my kids, so they're critics. David, when you grew up as a fan of, I think, Spielberg movies, right? You watched E.T. and
Yes,
Jaws when you were
absolutely.
younger. So when you get the job, when you get hired to write this role, first of all, how does that happen that you get tapped to write such a massive Steven Spielberg project? And does being a fan of his make it easier to write a Steven Spielberg movie?
Well, yes, I did grow up. I saw Jaws when I was 13. So between, you have these formative years, I think, when all your tastes are formed between about 12 and 24. And the music you listen to, the movies you see, the art you respond to, I think that's becomes baked into you for the rest of your life. And it can grow and it can expand, and you drop some things and you add some things. But between 13 and 19, I saw Jaws, E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So that's an intense, oeuvre to be overwhelmed with. So I was working at Universal in the early 90s. I had an overall deal, and I was just making my first studio movie, Death Becomes Her, from what we'd assumed would be an independent script, but somehow became like a big studio movie. And Steven had asked for the script and read it, and was looking for somebody else to take a shot at Jurassic Park, because they'd had a few writers and it hadn't quite worked out. So I went in. I was young. It's not a terribly likable story because it happened pretty easily for me. So, they said, will you take a look at this book and just go tell them what you think? So I went in and I pitched the way I saw it. And he said, sounds good. When can you start? So, not a story of great struggle, I'm afraid. But what did become a struggle was trying to put out of your mind, oh my God, that's Steven Spielberg. He's actually sitting right over there, and become a collaborator instead of a fan, because the surest route to failure is to be a fan and write something that you think he would like, or that you think is in the spirit of his movies. You really have to write something you like and see if he responds.
Was the original opening something that you wrote thinking that he would like?
The original opening was a scene I took from the book.
Okay.
And I wrote it because I thought it would make a great opening. And it was at the hospital in Costa Rica, in the jungle, and they bring in a body, and an emergency room worker, questions them about how this happened, and it was a really cool scene. And Steven read it and said, I really like your opening. And he said, but there's a problem here. The whole thing is the emergency room worker says, this was not a construction accident. And he said, it's just a lot like a scene from one of my movies before. And I said, no, that's ridiculous. It's a great scene. It's really great. And as I was telling it, I was like, oh shit, it's in Jaws. That's the problem is, so many of his scenes are so iconic that they do get, hardwired into your head, and you can parrot them back to him, which is a route to failure.
I think like screenwriters are often very underappreciated for their contributions to films. But we always credit the directors. Even myself as a critic, I say this is this director's film. This is every decision belongs to them. I'm thinking specifically of like an iconic moment from this movie. The scene at the T-Rex paddock that we all know, where like we hear the bass, we hear the sound approaching of footsteps, and then we see the cup of water. That's all in your screenplay. Like I looked at the screenplay, and like you describe looking at like the concentric circles that the water makes. Can you talk about like how you devise a scene like that, and how the process of getting that onto the big screen, and how it kind of transforms from the page to the screen?
I'm delighted to talk about things that screenwriters actually thought of that it looks like the director thought of. That example does not happen to be one of them. Oh, shit. Because that is Steven's all the way. He was driving his kids to school and had some liquid in a cup holder, and his kids were into some music that was very bassy, and he could see the vibration of the bass, and said, "Oh, that's a T-Rex footsteps." So that's actually his. But you are right in that a screenwriter has to fully imagine the movie pictorially. People tend to think that screenwriting is, well, you write up what they say and the director fills in the rest. And dialogue is only one of the tools in a writer's toolbox, and it's not even the strongest or most effective tool. Anytime you can think of visuals and create a great visual or create a great cut, then that's screenwriting. Mm-hmm. Which is different from all other kinds of writing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole dialogue thing where, I think you see that in the Oscars, right? The most verbal, the most dialogue-heavy screens always win Best Screenplay at the Oscars and such. And it's not that this movie, first of all, this movie has some great dialogue. Because, if you think of blockbusters, great blockbuster movies, it's not something, you don't typically consider them for, their great screenplays, their great dialogue. Think of, Luke, I Am Your Father. As memorable as that is, it's not Pulitzer Prize-winning material, or Jack Rose. But here you have, Life Breaks Free, things like Man Destroys God, or Dinosaurs Kill Man, and then Laura Dern's response. When you were writing that, did you know that they would be essentially they're memes now, right? Did you know that they would have the longevity that they did?
No, you're looking for a great way to you're just trying to express your ideas as clearly and concisely as possible. And the lines that stick around and that you hear back later are never the ones you imagined would stick around. The line I hear more from this movie than any other is "hold on to your butts," which I don't think is, Shakespearean in its, aspiration, but it is effective and it's right to the point. And you probably should hold on to your butt at that point. So it's you're just trying to write the best dialogue you can. I think that there are moments that come when you feel like there's a speech here. There's a thing, there's a longer verbal expression, but it wasn't necessarily for this movie. The wordiest we got was Jeff Goldblum's, things in the meeting with the slides all around him. And a lot of that was from Crichton's novel, and then our own ideas thrown in from our own, research and meeting with people.
Steven Spielberg's friend Martin Scorsese recently, he's been touring with this new film called The Irishman, which is absolutely amazing. Make sure you all buy your tickets for that when it opens here on Friday. But on that tour, he's made some comments about Marvel movies that kind of triggered the internet. One of them being that, they're theme park movies, they're not cinema. And, coming here, it's like, if you think about a theme park movie, like the ultimate theme park movie is Jurassic Park, which I don't think makes it not cinema. Because, I don't think anyone will argue that Jurassic Park is not cinema. I'm wondering, what do you think of that kind of distinction between theme park movies and cinema?
First of all, I think the internet should lighten up on the getting triggered about anything. Just please.
Yeah.
When do we all get so touchy? If Martin Scorsese wants to express his opinion about any movie, he's more than earned the right to. Let him. I get it. He doesn't like them. They're not for everybody. That's fine. They're for a lot of people. But I also think people have been arguing about what's a movie and what's a good movie and what should movies be since movies have been around, which is part of the reason we love them. I think when sound came in, it was heresy. People were outraged, and movies are pictures. How can now you've got people talking all over it and the cameras stop moving? It's terrible. Things change, and different kinds of movies appeal to different audiences. I think I would never want to speculate about what another person's thinking, but maybe part of what he's responding to is a lot of the money that used to be freed up for investment in many different kinds of movies is now solely used for these kinds of movies. As studios and the massive corporations that own them see what kind of money they can make with these movies, they now are committing 60%, 70% of their production funds to making those kinds of movies and squeezing out necessarily other movies. So I don't like it either, but I think that's not your question, is what I think. Your question was about theme park movies. It was when we worked on this, we were conscious of the irony that we're making a movie about greedy theme park people for greedy theme park people. We thought that was kind of funny. And there's, a shot in the movie that lingers over pajamas and a lunchbox or whatever it is. So we're trying to acknowledge that there is some irony in that and some sort of meta implications to what we were doing. Movies have continually gotten bigger. I think the first knock on that I remember was in the mid-'70s with Jaws and Star Wars. Now that studios have seen how much money they can make, they want everything to be a big summer movie. Then again, with the dawn of CG, now that such spectacular things are available, that's all they want anymore. And it's true. And now that you can make 6 movies on a subject, nobody wants to make just one anymore. That's also true. I think in general, everything was better before applies over every generation. I think it's certainly true. I think, then again, penicillin was a pretty great invention. So, I don't know.
Well, speaking to the other part, though, the other thing that you were saying, where everyone just wants to, like, what Scorsese might be complaining about is the lack of theater space for anything but a Marvel movie, or like how every other studio, he had to go to Netflix to make a $160 million movie because no studio would make it for him because all they want to do is make Marvel movies, right? And in a way, we could blame that on you because you wrote SpiderMan, and that's you did an amazing job with SpiderMan, and that's how we got to this stage. That's what created this renaissance. So would you?
Yeah. Well, I did it on purpose. It was with malice, and I do apologize. Okay, sure. But SpiderMan, in our defense, was a risky movie. Comic book movies had been laughable for years. The last good one was one of Burton's Batman movies, right? Prior
like
to
the second Batman movie?
God, I don't remember. It was
I
not so
love
good.
it. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yes.
It was one of them, but like there hadn't been, the Superman movies in the 70s were fine, but they had gotten really laughably awful comic book movies, and they were poison. Nobody'd invest in them. Nobody would make them. And if you really want to look for somebody to blame, and I think you should, and that's a valuable way to spend your time, James Cameron wrote a treatment for Spider-Man, and the fact that James Cameron was even considering Spider-Man gave it a certain legitimacy. And Columbia fought hard to get the rights to it away from, I think it was Canon at the time, a company long since defunct. And we used part of, some of Cameron's ideas in the movie. But Spider-Man they were going to commit actual money, a serious amount of money to making a comic book movie. And our idea was that we spend 45 minutes on who this guy is and how he becomes Spider-Man. Don't race through it. Don't hurry to get him into the costume. Don't hurry the effects. What is his personal life like? What's it, and let's try to end the story where the hero and the lady aren't together. So they were some not controversial. There were some non-standard choices, and certainly to make a comic book movie at all in 2001 was a non-standard choice. So it was a little nervy, and then of course when now they've had such massive success, it's all anybody wants to do. But that was early on. Mm-hmm. We didn't know we were going to break everything.
I have to this is more of a comment than a question. Don't do this. But I do appreciate how even with these blockbuster films, you are very character focused. Like when we talk about the focus of the character of Spider-Man and Peter Parker in that movie, I feel like even the Raptors here have real personality. You guys inject them with personality in this movie. But moving on from that, another one of my favorites in terms of movies that you've worked on is Mission Impossible. But I know that was that's my favorite Mission Impossible and I love that franchise in general. But I know that wasn't a pretty experience for you as a writer.
Oh no, it was horrible. It was. There's an old expression: "Good experience, bad movie." Which means if you're too happy during the making of the thing, it's probably not a very dynamic or interesting movie. In that case, the opposite held true. It was the thing. I came in, they'd had a script. Then I'd worked with Brian De Palma recently, and he brought me in to give the new script a try. And I wrote a new script, and that went really well. And the movie got up and going. And then Tom wanted Robert Towne to come and work on it some, and I got very upset. We all got mad and yelled at each other. And then they went off to London, and the movie kind of got greenlit, and they were going to start shooting. They were 3 or 4 weeks away, but then the studio didn't like what the script had become, and they were going to shut them down, and they called me, and I went back. But they didn't. But they kept Towne, and they put us in 2 different hotels so we'd never run into each other. And I'd write pages for Brian, and Towne would write pages for Tom, and then everybody'd wave fax paper at each other and yell at each other, and somehow it turned into a coherent movie. Yeah. And I remember after a screening of it, when it had worked out, Robert Towne, who is a lovely elder statesman of Hollywood and obviously great genius and one of the greatest screenwriters of all time, but I hated his guts at the time because he'd rewritten me. He came over and he gave me a big hug, and I was looking over his shoulder, and I saw Brian over his shoulder behind him, and Brian went. I just thought that was funny. So bad experience, good movie. Yeah. Go figure.
That's like the screenwriter version of battle rapping, then, right? Like the two of you trading pages on set and stuff.
Kinda. Yeah. It was a little bit, but it turned out well.
Yeah. Well, another experience you had with Tom Cruise. But now skipping over War of the Worlds, and
War of the Worlds was not at all like that. By the way, a very pleasant experience throughout, and some people working really well together, and I thought the movie turned out well. Now, go on. What filth do you want to spew
That
now?
movie turned out real well, and then came The Mummy, which I mean I think bears a lot of the frustrations we might have with this industry today when we're talking about Marvel, like how Marvel set the stage for it. Now we want shared universes, and then you got Mummy, which had to, or I think at a certain stage you got Mummy because there was other writers before that.
Yeah, I was on it for 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah, and basically that was an attempt. I imagine you must have got a lot of notes of how do we create a dark universe out of this, right? I mean, yeah. Can you tell us about that? That experience tells you about this industry?
Yes, I could tell you, but I'd never work in this industry. No, it's Universal is we tend, when you mention a company name, you think of them as monolithic, but it's really people, trying to do the best job they can. And they were trying to do a thing with their monsters where they would be able to unite them in a sort of Marvel-esque way into a bunch of interlocking movies that make sense, which again is ambitious. It's not completely fresh as an idea because it's sort of trying to do what someone else has done. And it didn't work, and it didn't work right away. And to their credit, I think they realized, well, it was made abundantly clear, this doesn't work. And that's not how you. Turns out that's not how you start a franchise. It's not how you start an interlocking movies. It's not how you proceed with an idea. You have to make one great one and then see what can develop out of that. And they realized that right away and said even publicly, "Our bad. That didn't work. Let us think about this for a bit." And I have a lot of respect for that. I think that was the right decision. And it's not easy to admit you're wrong, but I always felt like the wrap gift on any movie, when a movie wraps, traditionally you hand out some sort of gift to the crew. And I always thought it should just be a T-shirt that says it seemed like a good idea at the time, because they do. Like we're well-meaning people who go in trying our very best, thinking this could be great, and often it isn't. Usually it isn't, which is why when something does turn out great, it lasts for a really long time.
So then, I mean, now you're writing a novel, or you wrote a novel. And when I was reading this novel, I was taken by, just from the opening pages, how much I could see, like visually, like you really set the scene. I should tell you, Cold Storage. It is about a fungus that kind of escapes, and 2 security guards have to contain it overnight, essentially.
It pretty much takes place in 24 hours.
24 hours. Yeah,
it's a science fiction horror thriller that is available now in bookstores called Cold Storage. Yes, that's correct.
And now I can't. Now I forgot what I was going to talk to you about. But talk about going from being a screenwriter to writing a novel. And because I imagine you have all this visual space in your head that you usually put down on paper. How does that translate when you start writing a novel?
It's 25 years of writing in images is very hard to just leave behind. So the primary thing in movies that you learn is if you can express it in images, it's going to be more effective than anything else. Movies are stories told in pictures. And so I found that in writing the book, setting the scene and describing the scene and seeing the images was really important. But what I found sort of intoxicating about writing a novel was that for the first time in 25 years, I could talk about what people were thinking or feeling. And I could digress, and I could go into, strange little scientific segues, and I could do 3 pages about a cockroach that proves to be vital to the storytelling. Like Jurassic Park, which is the reason we're sort of talking about the book and that movie at the same time, there's a lot of very well-researched science in this that is going to be difficult to express in a movie because it'll really only work in a book. But having said that, I'm writing a screenplay now because we're trying to make a movie out of it. So I'm now faced with all the things that I gleefully wrote as a novelist and thought this could never be in a screenplay. And now I got to put it in a screenplay. So.
And I mean, you mentioned that it takes place over 24 hours. The main action, there's a prologue that happens
30 years
before. That's a trend in your work. Jurassic Park, for the most part, takes place over 24 hours, pretty much. Panic Room, overnight. Premium Rush, I think is is it 90 minutes?
About 90 minutes, almost exact time.
Yeah. So what is it about constraining yourself to either like with Panic Room, you had it in one location, like constraining yourself to a single location or a single time frame, like to these tight constrictions. Like, does that help you with storytelling? Is that something that
it helps enormously? I remember Bob Zemeckis called it a bottle. I told him I was working on The Paper, which is a newspaper movie that takes place over exactly 24 hours. And he said, "So you're doing a bottle, huh?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know that. It sounds cool. What is it?" And the idea is basically because the world is too big and choices are too vast, movies thrive on something that's constrained. So if you can say it all takes place in blah, 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 or it all takes place over this amount of time, or there's only 3 characters in the whole movie, that kind of limitation often leads to a great sort of explosion of creative ideas, because your storytelling mind is trying to solve these problems within some very specific limits that have been laid down. And I've always found that really helpful. This thing I just directed called You Should Have Left, that's for streaming in the spring, is a bottle in terms of it really is only 4 characters in the whole movie. And I just thrive on that. I think it's energizing.
I'm going to throw it to the audience, see what questions you guys all have. Can we start with the person who tossed their hand up right away in that row? Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, behind you.
Sorry, man.
Sorry about that. You got to wait for a mic.
Is it cool if I ask about The Lost World, or should we stick to Jurassic Park?
It's okay with me.
Okay, cool. So I know The Lost World, writing that was kind of a long and complicated process. I know Steven Spielberg started storyboarding it early in '95 before he hired you on. You had a baby during writing it. I'm just wondering, why cut out, there's so many characters in the novel, like there's Richard Levine and R.B. Benton, all these other characters. Why create so many for the actual film? Like Dr. Judson, who I know you got cut out, and et cetera. What's his name? Nick Van Owen, all those kind of guys. What informed those kind of decisions? And was there ever a point when The Lost World, your script, was ever fairly close to the novel, or was it always kind of its own thing?
One thing to remember is I was very drunk most of the time. In '95, you said.
Yeah, yeah.
Just kidding. The novel was not. We had a number of ideas that we were working with before Michael said he wanted to write a novel of it, and then he said he wanted to write a novel, and he did. And we did use much of the novel, but there were a number of ideas we were working with already that we were, feeling pretty good about. So we did depart from the novel, which was, just different from what we wanted to do. The thing at that point, everybody starts to feel a little ownership over the idea. After, certainly it was his book and his idea, and then it became our movie and our ideas. And so we went in a different direction. It's hard to answer the specifics of, we just were kind of more entranced by some of the stuff we'd thought of than some of the stuff that was in the novel, although we did use much of what was in the novel.
Do you have a mic somewhere? Hand that down.
How did you, for Jurassic Park, figure out the balance between spectacle and the really well-written, character-driven moments? It seems like it would have been such a juggling act to figure that out.
It was. And what's funny is when it came out, the characters were sort of derided as not being adequate. But they've aged well, and people seem to remember them. And look at the question you just asked. So it's the great challenge of working in the age of CG, is that you have all this remarkable imagery that can be created of things that don't even exist, and yet you're trying to make people real and relatable, because that's the only thing that'll make your story work, because spectacle only works for so long. It's a reason that IMAX movies tend to be about 38 minutes. They don't sustain because they don't build characters and stories and try to tell in an arc. So that's the thing. I mean, CG movies are much harder for writers and actors than they are for a director. I think a director finds, can find great comfort and excitement in the spectacle, especially if they're technically oriented. But they are ever more dependent on the writers and actors to try and bring out the humanity in those moments. So it is a great juggling act, and it's really a struggle.
I just wanted to add on that. I think you mentioned that there, like when you have a movie with such a giant premise, where the premise is the star, it's hard to have the characters compete with the premise. No?
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because especially, they're dinosaurs, and they're photorealistic dinosaurs for the first time in the history of cinema. So, when the couple goes off to talk about their relationship, you're like, yeah, okay, why don't you go out there and talk? Because maybe in the background there'll be some dinosaurs. We can look at the dinosaurs, which is all you really care about. So it is, yeah, it's a real struggle.
Sir, in the front row.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I noticed in your profile, a lot of your films, the directors turn to you for the first of a franchise. Like, you were involved in the first Mission Impossible movie, the very first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire, and the Mummy, which would have been the first of another franchise, the monster, and this, of course. Why is that? Do you think directors feel comfortable with your ideas to launch a franchise, or?
I think that there was a time when studios were comfortable starting something new, and I think I was very lucky to be a working screenwriter in the 90s, because it's the last time I can remember that a truly original piece of material could become something else. And I guess none of these were truly original. They now? But they weren't remakes, which is different. They didn't have a proven track record in movies. SpiderMan, as we talked about, comic book movies had a record of recent failure in movies. Mission Impossible was a 20-year-old TV show. No one could understand why anybody wanted to do it. And this was a hit book, but turning a hit book into a great big movie is not always a given. It's not a sure thing. And so I think some of it, to be honest, was I happened to be in the right place at the right time. I also feel I did good work. I certainly showed up on time every day and tried to write as well as I could, and with very few typos. But I do think I happened to be present at a sort of at a great flowering of creativity in Hollywood, I think.
Yeah, and what about the reference in this movie to Pirates of the Caribbean? I mean, now it's another franchise, and I mean, back then we didn't know, but was that your idea to make it a line, or?
Yeah, that was a little self-referential thing. I'd written an independent movie called Bad Influence a few years before, and in it, someone says their fantasy was always to get off the Pirates of the Caribbean ride and just live there, because he's living this sort of horrible corporate job existence that he doesn't like. And that was teasing my older brother, who had said that once when he was young, and we all teased him about it for the next 30 years, as families do. So I wanted to see how many movies I could get a reference to Pirates of the Caribbean in just to tease my brother. I did it 3 times, but then it became a little stilted.
We got the mic up there.
Hi, just wondering, what is your process when you're using a novel? Like, do you read it, sort of skim, take points, or do you read it several times before you start building?
First of all, as you started that question, I thought you were saying, what is your problem? Which is also a totally valid question, by the way. The first time I read the book, I read it to see if I feel like I can bring anything to this. Does this make my brain swim with ideas or no? Then the second time, I've usually at that point said, okay, I'm going to do this. So I read it again and just start highlighting things I like. Trying to read at a normal reading pace, but just, oh, that's good. Oh, that's cool. Oh, I like that. Oh, yes, that's fine. And then the third time the work starts, and I outline the book exactly as the author wrote it. I'm a big believer in 3x5 scene cards laid out on a big table so you can see the structure of the whole thing. And I just outline what the structure of the book is. And in doing that, in forcing myself to write down, they meet at the chapel or whatever the scene is, I start to see, oh, I see, you were using this to segue to that, and you're cutting to the storyline with the blah, blah, blah every third chapter. And then I can start to internalize what the structure of the book is. And then after that, I start turning that book structure into a movie structure. I throw out things that I know aren't going to be there, and I'm literally picking up a card and throwing it, and then looking, well, what do I have, and where do I need connective tissue to make these scenes flow together, and can I combine this character with that one? Oh, yes, I can. Good. And then I lay it all out. The fourth reading of the book isn't till I've written. It kind of happens while I'm writing a draft because I have to refer to chapters in the book. Then I try to put the book away for a good long time and let the movie become the movie. Then I go back and read the book for now a fifth time probably to see what I lose. Are there any gems that I absolutely need to put in my movie script? So that was a pretty specific answer, but it was a specific question, so thank you.
The gentleman that has the mic on that side.
Hi. Is there anything you can speak on to your relationship while working with Fincher on Panic Room? Was there communication prior to the movie, during the movie, or during the writing of the script, and also while it's shooting?
Yeah, he was great. David Fincher's, it kind of depends what you're doing on the movie. I would not want to be a studio executive working with David because he's difficult because he's brilliant and he sticks to exactly what he wants. And there's an old expression, who cares wins, which I don't think means who cares who wins. It means he who cares wins. And David cares. I mean, Fincher just doesn't stop. His stories about doing 80, 90 takes, are true. He's obsessive and determined. And I asked him once, so our relationship was quite good. He's also very defensive about writers, defensive of his writers. We were in a studio meeting once before we started shooting, and the head of the studio gave me some note on the script, and Fincher just excoriated her. He just laid into her and, mocked the note, and he was very harsh. And we came out of the meeting, and I said, wow, that was good. Well, thanks for that. And he said, yeah, you should think about that note, though. She's got a good point. I was like, but you killed her. And he said, well, I just didn't like her talking to you. So he doesn't want anybody to do it but him, which I appreciate because I think the best ideas come from the fewest number of people in the room, and it all has to go through the director. I'm not surprised that he directs features as infrequently as he does, because it's become increasingly this massive, relentless, collaborative experience. And I don't think good movies necessarily come of that. I mean, competent movies can come of that, but not truly distinctive ones. So I'm a big fan of Fincher. I think he's great, although probably difficult if you're the money person.
Got time for one more question. I believe the mic is up there beside someone's got their hand in the corner.
Do you cast the movie in your mind as you're writing, just as a tool to help?
I don't. So I'm not. So we'll do one more question because it's not a very interesting answer. But it's a good question, and a lot of writers do, but I don't, because I feel like if you box yourself into an actor, you are consciously writing to their strengths and limitations, and I think it should be it should be allowed to be a character first. And then if once an actor is cast, invariably and inevitably you will think about, what they might do well or poorly. But before that, the character should be the character.
So David,
could we do one more?
Yeah,
one last question up top.
Where's the other mic?
Any knock on your question, sir?
Right, dead center up top, way last row.
Oh, you have okay.
My question's about the Raptors. I noticed, I grew up with this film and then discovered years later that the Raptors in real life were actually only 2 or 3 feet. Obviously in this film you made them very badass. Thank you, because that led to naming our local team in the basketball arena. But I just wanted to know, was that always a plan in the script to make them larger than life and such a large role? And were you aware that actually led this movie to naming our current NBA champion team?
We were going to call them the Mighty Ducks, but apparently that had already been done. Now, it's been a few years, so forgive me. But yes, these are actually, Velociraptor is the coolest name in the world, right? So we needed to call them Velociraptors. Velociraptors, as found in the, paleological record, are actually smaller than these. These, I cannot remember what raptors this size corresponds to. It might be Utah raptor, or there's another raptor that is the size of this. Deinonychus was bigger, wasn't it? Well, there were a number of them, yes. And however, we wanted the perfect size with what is clearly the coolest name that would inevitably lead to championship sports. So as you can see, our hands were tied.
Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for being here. It's a real honor.